I want to thank all of you for being on time and being ready to go to work. I want to apologize for canceling yesterday's markup, but we're going to proceed today concerning our sixth appropriations bill of fiscal year 2019, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill. We will also consider the fiscal year 2019 302Bs as well. We have a lot to do, so let's turn immediately to the consideration of the THUD bill. Recognize Chairman Diaz-Balart to present his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, today I'm pleased to present the fiscal year 2019 THUD bill to the committee for, again, your consideration, with obviously the goal of a favorable motion to the House. First, I want to thank my ranking member, Mr. Price. I really couldn't ask for a better partner, collaborator in developing this bill. And again, I continue to, as you know, value your contributions both to the process and to the product, and I'm grateful to that. And will continue to do so as this bill moves forward. Again, Chairman Frelinghuysen, look, this is an individual who has shown the nation what it means to be a leader who can reach across the aisle to get big things done. And this bill reflects our chairman's commitment to rebuilding our nation's infrastructure, including the critical Northeast corridor where so much of our economic activity in our country takes place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership. The bill also reflects the chairman's commitment to take care of the most vulnerable among us, especially the elderly, the disabled, and of course our veterans. I want to thank Mrs. Lowy for her commitment to the programs in this bill and for her continued leadership and collaboration with Chairman Frelinghuysen. The bill we are considering today provides $71.8 billion in discretionary budget authority. This is $1.5 billion above the enacted level and $23.8 billion above the budget request. This bipartisan CAPS deal signed into law, the CAPS deal signed into law by the President earlier this year, set the framework for the investments that you see in this bill before you today. There is a consensus that we need to make major investments in our roads, in our bridges, in our railways, in our seaports, in our airports. This bill, members, builds on our accomplishments in the 2018 Omnibus and makes a second historic down payment to rebuild our nation's infrastructure. You see, this THUD bill is the infrastructure bill that Congress will be dealing with. At the same time, we work to ensure that there is no place for waste, no place for abuse of our constituents' hard-earned taxpayer dollar. We also made sure we didn't grow the bureaucracy here in Washington, D.C. This is why we prioritize authorized formula programs that get money directly to the states and the localities for both housing and transportation investments. Now, for the Department of Transportation, the bill provides $28 billion in discretionary funding and $88 billion in total funding, including obligation limitations, consistent with the FAST Act. For the BUILD program, formerly known as TIGER, something that a lot of you obviously have a lot of interest in, this bill provides $750 million with a balance among rural, suburban, and urban projects, and a set-aside also of $250 million for port infrastructure, for ports. For the federal aviation, the bill supports full operation of the air traffic control system, full operation. We invest $1.3 billion in NextGen, which has been a huge priority for me, for the subcommittee, and for the entire committee. We also provide $500 million for additional discretionary airport grants to modernize airports, big and small airports across our great country. The bill provides $4.25 billion in federal highway funding, above and beyond, I want to repeat that, $4.25 billion in federal highway, which is above and beyond the FAST Act. That's a 10% increase for highways, for bridge projects across our country. This is the largest increase in the bill, $1.7 billion above the Omni. Again, for roads, for bridges that go to our states. Every state, every single state, and thousands of localities will see the real impact of this funding as construction crews get to work on roads and bridges and repairing roads and bridges that are so needed. This investment will help us strengthen our infrastructure, create jobs, and maintain our economic competitiveness well into the future. This bill funds rail programs at $3.2 billion. This includes critical safety investments with an additional $150 million for positive train control grants. Now, the rail funding in this bill will also provide significant long-term economic benefits as we continue to address the state of good repair backlog, including on the Northeast corridor, something that is a huge priority for all of us and for me as well. Now, we know that this is a priority also for the chairman, and I am so proud to say that it is my priority, the subcommittee's priority, and I hope also all of your priorities. The bill provides $13.6 billion for the Federal Transit Administration. This fully funds the FAST Act formula grants and includes $2.6 billion for the Capital Investment Grant Program. Again, consistent with last year. Also included is an additional $800 million for transit infrastructure grants that will quickly get funds to both the rural and the urban communities to rebuild aging transit infrastructure assets. The bill includes a provision to address aggressive action, and I want to repeat this. The bill includes a provision to address aggressive action by the Chinese government to dominate transit manufacturing with unfair subsidies to their state-owned companies. I want to reemphasize that. I think all of us have been hearing about how aggressive the Chinese government has been. So we do have a provision here which I think is crucial, and I would obviously ask for everyone's support. And I want to particularly thank the chairwoman of the Defense Subcommittee for her leadership in that issue, because not only is it an economic issue, I would argue it's also a national security issue. So thank you, Madam Chairwoman. In our housing title, we once again provided funding to continue serving those who need housing assistance, with a priority on the elderly, the disabled, and yes, the veterans of our country. Our commitment to help the most vulnerable among us with decent, affordable housing also helps get families back on their feet and back to self-sufficiency. The bill provides targeted resources to meet the needs of some of our most vulnerable populations. So let me go through some of those. Funding is provided for 30,000 new Frelinghuysen vouchers for non-elderly disabled families. This investment will dramatically improve the lives of disabled people and their families for years to come. We provide an additional $40 million to serve more homeless veterans. That's on top of the $650 million to support 90,000 vets already served by HUD-VASH programs. $50 million is included for mobility demonstration that will help families with children move closer to jobs and independence. This exciting initiative is included on behalf of, and I've worked very closely with Chairman Hensarling and Chairman Duffy, who have been working on a bipartisan basis to address intergenerational poverty for families served by HUD. Sadly, government subsidies can actually breed dependency by trapping families in neighborhoods with few jobs, few opportunities, and few prospects, and sometimes even bad schools. So there's mountains of data that show that when families move better to move closer or to better areas, not only do the adults do better, but their kids, the children, they stay in school longer and have significantly higher earnings as adults. This is an exciting opportunity to break the cycle of poverty and give HUD residents the dignity of self-sufficiency. Very, very proud that we were able to do that working with our colleagues. Now, along with funds included in the manager's amendment, we will provide $50 million in the homeless program for housing and supportive services for victims of domestic violence. $393 million for person living with AIDS, and $100 million for competitive tribal housing grants to address the severely distressed housing in Indian country. This bill also makes important investments in housing infrastructure. Included are $3.3 billion for CDBG and $1.2 billion for the home program. These programs get money straight to state and local governments to support decision-making, frankly, where it should happen, and that's at the community, at the local level. Again, I want to reiterate that this bill is the infrastructure bill that Congress will be dealing with potentially for the rest of Congress. And I hope and I expect, and that's why we're here today, that it will get bipartisan support. Mr. Chairman, let me just spend a couple minutes on thanking staff. We all do that, but I think you blessed me with the best team, by the way. Even among the appropriators, I think I'm blessed with the best team. And I know that might create some conflicts, but it does, right? Look, first, Cesar Gonzalez and Chris Sweet of my staff have been phenomenal, and you all have worked with them. Doug Distrud, I've mentioned him before. Cheryl Tucker, who when I have bad days, she always figures out a way to just uplift us all in the office. Carl Barrick, who is brilliant, and I've mentioned him before. Jennifer is Ulra, who I don't know why, but she's whenever I forget things, she's always got her list, my list ready, just always there. Matt Anderson, by the way, who is about to have twins. And so, and then we've had somebody working on our team, Jad Atala, and I know that he's going to go back to his regular life, but Jad, I know that you will never forget, where are you? I know that you're never going to forget your experience here, and it's been a privilege. It's been a privilege. And then, of course, from Democratic, Joe and Angela, who have been phenomenal to work with throughout this time. Thank you for your amazing talent. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I recommend that the committee report this bill favorably to the House, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz-Balart. I was pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Price, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by again thanking our subcommittee chairman, Mr. Diaz-Balart, for his efforts to accommodate the requests of Democratic members and his collaborative style, his collaborative approach throughout this process. Mr. Diaz-Balart continues to be accessible and receptive to many of our priorities, and I've enjoyed working with him and will continue to do so. I also want to join him in thanking our staff, majority and minority, committee and personal staff who have put a great many hours and a great deal of effort into this bill. As the chairman just mentioned, this year's allocation is $71.8 billion for critical transportation, housing, and community development programs at DOT, HUD, and related agencies. This is $1.5 billion over last year's enacted level. It allows us to build on the success of the recently enacted 2018 Omnibus, which represented an important down payment to address our nation's pressing infrastructure and housing needs. The bill before us contains robust funding for transit and rail programs that the President's budget sought to eliminate. It preserves the popular Tiger grant program and ensures an appropriate balance between rural and urban projects within that program. And it contains additional budget authority for aviation, transit, and highway projects above the FAST Act authorized levels. On the housing side of the ledger, the funding is less robust, but largely locks in the increases that were included in the 2018 Omnibus. Section 8 vouchers and project-based rental assistance receive funding increases to account for inflation. But these numbers may need to be revisited as we receive updated cost estimates from HUD. I'm pleased the bill includes funding for several special voucher categories, including $40 million for additional HUD VASH vouchers for veterans, $390 million for Section 811 mainstream vouchers for the disabled, and $50 million to fund a new mobility demonstration project to assist low-income families find housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods. The Public Housing Capital Fund is flat funded at $2.75 billion. While that remains far below the demonstrated need, it does represent a notable improvement over the funding levels of recent years. Meanwhile, important housing grant programs like Section 202 for the elderly and Section 811 for the disabled receive enough funding to continue existing renewals and contracts, but not enough to construct new units, which we finally got back on track with in the 2018 omnibus, that is, some new construction. I hope we can revisit these numbers and return them to at least the 2018 level, because the need is acute among both our elderly and disabled populations, and these programs have proved their worth in addressing that need. Community Development Block Grants receive level funding at $3.3 billion. The Home Investment Partnership Program, which is so often utilized as gap funding in new affordable housing developments, receives $1.2 billion. That's a slight cut from last year's enacted level. We need to push these numbers higher, particularly in the context of large funding increases in the transportation title of the bill that were added very late in the drafting process. I will offer 2 amendments this afternoon to address this problem. One, to restore parity between transit and highway funding, and another to increase funding for housing programs so we don't lose ground compared to last year's enacted levels. Finally, I want to register strong opposition to several controversy policy riders that were attached to this bill that attack high-speed rail, harm labor rights, and roll back transportation safety for the traveling public. I understand there are highway crash victims in attendance this afternoon. Their stories provide powerful testimony about the dangers of relaxing our transportation safety laws. I'll offer an amendment to strike these objectionable provisions, which must ultimately be removed if this bill is to sustain bipartisan support. Before I close, I want to raise concerns about the overall appropriations process this year. Our bill has a robust allocation, and that is largely the result of successful bipartisan negotiations that concluded earlier this year. Unfortunately, this collaborative approach has not been continued in determining allocations for fiscal year 2019. Now, as Chairman Diaz-Balart and I have both expressed, we enjoy a close working relationship at the subcommittee level, and I think that kind of relationship is replicated on most of our subcommittees. But that contrasts markedly with the partisan exclusion we've seen at the full committee level. Unlike the omnibus, House Democrats have been completely shut out of the discussions to determine how this significant increment of funding for 2019 will be allocated among the 12 appropriations bills. For weeks, we asked the majority to release the full slate of allocations so we could make informed decisions about many of our funding priorities, such as public health, environmental protection, education, job training, diplomatic and global aid programs that strengthen our national security. At the time, we feared that our colleagues in the majority were hiding the allocations because they were going to shortchange these priorities. Unfortunately, now that we finally have the full slate of allocations before us, these fears have largely been confirmed. This stands in stark contrast to the bipartisan allocation process in the Senate. Put straightforwardly, we need to realize that our subcommittee, no subcommittee, operates in a bubble. Our bill exists alongside 11 other bills, and we must consider our generous allocation in the context of damage done elsewhere. We have a major advantage compared to last year. We have a 2-year budget agreement, after all. This should let us write workable bills. Yet we may be headed down that same dreary path of budgetary dysfunction and public disgust. Everyone in this room knows how to avoid that. Everyone in this room knows how to avoid another season of shutdowns and showdowns. Instead of trying everything else first, why don't we do the right thing right now? Why not produce bipartisan bills that reflect bipartisan priorities across all 12 subcommittees, and then take them to the floor and pass them the old-fashioned way, one bill at a time, on budget, on time? Mr. Chairman, these issues go well beyond the purview of any one subcommittee. I remain hopeful that we will ultimately remedy the larger allocation issue, that we will clean up the riders in this and other bills, and that we'll proceed to get our work done for the American people. I look forward to continuing to work together in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Thank you, Chairman Diaz-Balart, as well. Thank you both for your work together. As we all know, and as we've heard here this afternoon, our nation's infrastructure has been neglected for far too long. Crumbling roads, aging bridges, rail lines, clogged waterways are inhibiting economic growth and slowing our nation down. Hardworking Americans who contribute to the world's largest economy deserve safe, reliable, and efficient transportation. So this bill provides a much-needed boost in funding to make vital improvements for our infrastructure. Combined with the funding in last year's omnibus, Congress has invested an additional $22.4 billion above fiscal year 2017 in our transportation infrastructure to get our country and economy moving again. I'm particularly pleased to see increased funding for critical rail and transit priorities across the nation. This includes $1.9 billion for Amtrak, of which $650 million is for the Northeast Corridor, one of the busiest systems in the world. Funding is also provided for the State of Good Repair grants at $500 million, $250 million above the current level. These investments will address critical rail maintenance, replacement, and rehabilitation projects nationwide and along the Northeast Corridor. These are needs that must be addressed promptly to just maintain safe and reliable current rail services for American families and businesses who ship by freight, by rail. Lastly, I'm pleased to see important funding for critical mass transit projects nationwide, including commuter rail and bus transit. These investments will be used to build critical transportation infrastructure that is vital to our nation's economy and national security. This includes appropriations, as the Chairman has mentioned, for additional funding for the Northeast Corridor, which is not only critical for New York and New Jersey, but to the entire country. More than 20 states from Florida to Maine depend on the rail system on the East Coast, not to mention the thousands of passengers who travel it each day. I worry greatly about the possibility of a catastrophic event in one of those tunnels, the security and economic implications of which would cripple the East Coast. As I told Secretary Chow, the administration's opposition to these types of improvements is baffling and frankly unacceptable. So I'm very, very glad to see that the Chairman has put in his bill money that provides funds to move ahead with these types of projects and move them forward. The administration has spent an inordinate amount of time thwarting these rail safety improvements, the completion of any of which might give some credibility to their infrastructure mantra. In addition to providing funding for the Department of Transportation, the bill also supports the Department of Housing and Urban Development and other critical community development programs. This includes funding for core community housing programs that provide shelter for the nation's most vulnerable citizens, housing for veterans, as has been mentioned, individuals with disabilities, and vouchers for families with children, which will help break the cycle of poverty and dependence. This bill also continues funding for the Community Development Grant Program, which the administration zeroed out in their budget submission. But fortunately, bipartisan support exists for its continuation. I'm grateful to Chairman Diaz-Balart, Ranking Member Price, the subcommittee, and our remarkable staff for their work on this legislation, exercising the power of the purse prudently on behalf of Congress as an institution and the people we represent at home. I urge the committee to support the institution, and I'm pleased to recognize Ms. Lowy for any comments she may wish to give.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Diaz-Balart, Ranking Member Price, and Chairman Frelinghuysen for your work on this bill. While numerous programs are well funded, there are a number of problems that make this a bill that Democrats just cannot support. It is outrageous that the Republican raw deal slashes home by $162 million, while we will soon consider subcommittee allocations that could pave the way to fund President Trump's border wall. Instead of making sufficient investments in public housing, The amounts provided to tenant and project-based rental assistance could lead to families losing vital support. This committee should do more to help Americans struggling to make ends meet and put a roof over their heads, not waste taxpayer dollars on Trump's boondoggle of a wall or let the Secretary of Transportation hire more political cronies. Instead of building upon the success of the omnibus, the majority has included harmful, divisive policy riders that have repeatedly been stripped from previous bills. Provisions to increase truck weights, preempt state and local meal and rest break laws, make our roads less safe. Efforts to cripple high-speed rail in California would result in job losses, forgo investments our community has already made, and block critical infrastructure that is so desperately needed. These riders have no place in a bipartisan spending bill. Just like every year, Democrat votes will be needed to enact appropriations law, so I hope we will soon start to work together in a bipartisan way to improve this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lowy, any further general discussion on the bill? If not, I look to the chairman for Ms. Capter is recognized.
I thank the chairman and members and just want to congratulate Chairman Diaz-Balart for bringing up this FY19 THUD bill. Transportation and housing obviously are critical pieces of our economy. I wanted to particularly thank the chairman and ranking member for including attention to the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation. I know Congressman Joyce and I, who share the Great Lakes region, at least the Ohio portion of it, know how terribly important this seaway corridor is as our seaborne economic lifeline, generating over $33.6 billion in direct business revenue and well over 250,000 jobs, over 226,000 jobs associated with that corridor. I also want to thank the chair and ranking member for including report language directing the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to coordinate remediation activities performed by Healthy Homes grantees with weatherization activities funded through the Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program when localities operate both programs. That coordination has been needed for a very long time. I also wanted to mention that in terms of the Home Investment Partnership Program and housing for the elderly, these have been cut by millions of dollars in the enacted levels for this coming year's bill. And I just wanted to put on the record that in our state, housing authorities across our region and as well the country are overwhelmed with waiting lists for access to affordable housing. In our state, which has a minimum wage of $8.15, an Ohioan would have to work 74 hours a week to afford a modest two-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. That means they'd have to have about 2 jobs to support their housing costs. And as you move to the coasts, that expands exponentially. But I appreciate the bipartisan nature of the bill before us, and but I do believe that the housing problems facing lower wage and lower income workers across our country are unlikely to improve without more concerted attention on housing. So it's unfortunate that that has been cut substantially in this bill. And again, I thank the chair and ranking member for doing a commendable job and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Capter. Any further remarks? I see a sign down there that says, "Call me Dutch." Mr. Rupersberger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just promoting my state. First, I want to thank the chairman, Des-Ballart, and also Ranking Member Price, and also Chairman Frelinghuysen and Ranking Member Lowy for working with us on this bill. As a Baltimore native and through my work in my younger years as a prosecutor and quasi-social worker in the Baltimore area, I have witnessed the terrible effects of lead poisoning. Even with low exposure, children living in homes with lead-based paint can experience significant cognitive impairment and emotional and behavioral issues. Data from the Center for Disease Control show that 6% of all children ages 1 to 2 have blood levels in toxic range, and minorities are overrepresented in this figure. It is a very real problem in all cities throughout the country. For this reason, I am very pleased to see HUD's lead hazard control programs funded at robust levels in this year's bill. Regarding another account important to Baltimore Community Development block grants, we're funded at stable levels. I'm grateful for what is in the bill, but it would be great to see the Community Development Fund increase next cycle. These grants go a long way in providing affordable housing and financing anti-poverty programs in areas in need. For example, in my district, we built a state-of-the-art vocational center for adults with intellectual disabilities. Finally, I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for funding the magnetic levitation technology deployment program. Maglev has the potential to revolutionize our transportation networks. There are talks about systems in California, Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee, and right here in the Northeast Corridor. If we can break ground on a route from Baltimore to Washington, it would bring over 74,000 paying jobs, supporting jobs, to the national capital region. Furthermore, we would see a $22.5 billion increase in our GDP and a 2 million ton reduction in greenhouse emissions. Just today, over on Route 295, which is one of the routes to Washington, BWI Airport, 120,000 cars a day ride there. It's a total gridlock problem. And the estimate for 2040 for the amount of people who will be living will increase 38% more. We have actually no plan for what we're going to do with this traffic except for a high-speed rail issue and widening. So it's extremely important, and I'm glad that we were able to address this. You referred to it in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman. We have to deal with this problem throughout the country, and my focus would be the Northeast Corridor. Thank you, and I yield back.
So glad that the gentleman likes the bill.
Thank you very much.
Any further general discussion? If not, I turn to Mr. Diaz-Balart to do a manager's amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment on the desk.
An amendment offered by Mr. Diaz-Balart.
I would ask.
Consider it read.
Thank you, sir. I would ask.
Please proceed.
Members, before you is a standard manager's amendment making non-controversial and requested changes to the bill and report. The amendment has been drafted in consultation and cooperation with Ranking Member Price and the minority. We've accommodated as many requests as we could on both sides of the aisle, and I would urge the adoption of this amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I have shared in the vetting of this amendment. The composition of this amendment includes many proposals from both sides of the aisle. The chairman has accommodated many Democratic requests, so I, too, encourage adoption of the amendment.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any further discussion on manager's amendment? Mr. Hartright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Clark.
And thank you, Chairman Diaz-Balart, for including my language in the manager's amendment. For many years, aviation has been the safest form of transportation in the United States. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of a strong regulatory framework built over time. It is an ongoing airline system safety culture that is one of the most ambitious in our nation's history. Mr. Chairman, pilots are trained to operate an aircraft while interacting with air traffic control, communicating with dispatch, checking current weather and forecasts, visually scanning for other aircraft, and monitoring engines, fuel, and other systems. In non-routine situations, the workload on the flight deck can increase significantly and unexpectedly in a short period of time. Addressing these situations requires two well-trained, well-qualified pilots to communicate in real time without delay. The report language I submitted prioritizes understanding the safety effects of two-person cockpit operations in any study that the Department of Transportation may be conducting. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Clark from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, want to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for including my amendment to restore the domestic violence set-aside in the Continuum of Care grant program to FY18 funding levels. Survivors of domestic violence have very unique housing challenges that our current housing assistance programs have a difficult time accommodating. That is why 50% of all homeless women report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness, and that 16% of all homeless people are victims of domestic violence. This set-aside is a significant step towards addressing this problem, and again, I thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for their continued commitment to assisting survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Any further discussion on the manager's amendment? Hearing none, the questions on the manager's amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Price is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment number 1 at the desk.
An amendment
I ask
offered
that
by
the reading be
Mr.
dispensed with.
Consider it done.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would strike 10 problematic policy riders that have no place in this bill. Each of these riders would change existing policy without being subject to thorough debate. Many of these issues were examined by the relevant authorizing committees during consideration of the FAST Act and were either resolved or deliberately excluded from the final legislation. These riders add controversy to the THUD bill. They add partisanship to a bill that ought to be bipartisan. Perhaps most importantly, some of these riders could undermine safety and rollback worker protections. And for the first time in recent history, the majority has decided to wade into trade policy, very unwisely, in the THUD bill. Let me briefly highlight these provisions. Section 126 in the bill prevents a section of road newly designated as an interstate in Kentucky from falling to the federal weight limit of 80,000 pounds. Section 133 in the bill would preempt state laws in California and more than 20 other states that provide meal and rest breaks to truckers. Authorizers rejected this language in conference consideration of the FAST Act. Sections 151 and 152 bar the use of any funds for high-speed rail in California. Section 165 would prohibit FDA funds from being used to procure transit systems and rolling stock from certain suppliers. This rider could threaten hundreds of well-paying jobs across the country and does mark the first time the THUD bill has meddled in trade policy. Section 171 would alter existing laws and place a cap on the penalty wages that must be paid to seafarers, including cruise line employees, when ship owners willfully or arbitrarily withhold their pay. Section 131 inappropriately interjects the committee into the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's effort to ensure the safe transportation of livestock. FMCSA already has an exemption process to address these concerns. All the interests involved here should avail themselves of that process. Section 132 does not allow the FMCSA to go forward with a rule regarding unsafe motor carriers. Section 134 creates an exception in truck length requirements for sugar beet carriers in Oregon. How's that for micromanagement? Section 234 prohibits HUD from directing a grantee to undertake a zoning law change as part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Now tell me, colleagues, what place do these 10 riders have in this bill? They've seriously put a burden on this bill in terms of its partisan and parochial and special interest character. They're better off removed. And most important, they do compromise safety and labor and public health and law enforcement priorities, and they violate. It's opposed. These riders are opposed by groups representing all these interests, including crash victims and their families. So I urge colleagues to support this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Diaz-Balart is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to the gentleman's amendment. Look, as members of Congress, we have an obligation to craft common sense legislation that benefits the people who send us here. Now, whether it's ensuring that hardworking truck drivers have uniform rest break regulations, to saving taxpayer dollars from unfeasible projects with runaway cost estimates, the policy provisions in this bill fulfill that obligation to the people that we represent. Moreover, my friends, these provisions are the product of hard work, of compromises made among the stakeholders on these issues. Let me just talk about one of the provisions, and I mentioned it before, that this amendment would eliminate. This bill includes a provision under the Federal Transit Administration that will prohibit the use of funds to award any contract to procure any transit system asset from China. That is in here, yes. This amendment would take this out. Now, I have grave concerns, national security concerns, and I hope all of us, and particularly if you sit on the Defense Subcommittee, I think all of us who understand a little bit about China should have grave national security concerns and also unfair competition concerns that we need to address. You see, Chinese companies, disproportionately subsidized and backed by the Chinese government, they're winning bids in the United States because they are able to come in at up to 50% lower due to these Chinese government state subsidies. So a Chinese state-owned enterprise, they're aggressively targeting U.S. market, the U.S. market, as a means of advancing what they're very clear about, China's Made in China 2025 initiative, which aims to explicitly overtake and destroy critical U.S. industries like railcar and rolling stock manufacturing. This is not a secret. That's plain to see. These companies are able to get around the Buy America laws. So, and again, I want to talk a little bit about on the national security side. China's involvement in building transit cars raises serious national security concerns. Metro transit cars rely on exceedingly sophisticated technology to ensure the safety of passengers, and some of these critical technologies are built, again, by the Chinese government. There is overwhelming evidence that Chinese entities engage in cyber espionage. There is no reason to think that somehow they will not do the same thing with transit car technology, and also to be able to have access to spy, to know where the U.S. individuals are traveling. So again, these provisions in the bill are important provisions. They've been worked out with the members of this subcommittee. And again, I would ask to defeat this amendment because that provision and others would be stricken from the bill. I thank you very much, and I yield back.
Further discussion? Ms. Lowy is recognized.
My friends, I rise in strong support of Mr. Price's amendment to strike harmful policy riders from this bill. Regardless of your opinions on any of these measures, they are most appropriately handled by the authorizing committees and experts at the agencies of jurisdiction. Measures that would threaten the safety of passengers on our roadways or worker protections should be provided adequate debate, not dropped into funding bills. Poison pill policy riders jeopardize the possibility of regular order. As with every year, Democratic votes are needed to pass appropriation bills, and these riders are non-starters for us. I want to make that very clear. These riders are non-starters for us. So I urge all of you to vote in favor of this common sense amendment to remove harmful policy riders from the bill. I yield back.
Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz, Ms. Granger is recognized. Excuse me.
I speak in strong opposition to the Price Amendment. This amendment eliminates the prohibition on federal funds being used to buy passenger transit rail cars from China. Several years ago, the Chinese purchased an American passenger rail manufacturing company named CRRC. While promising to manufacture products in the U.S., CRRC, in fact, was shipping fully assembled 100% Chinese passenger cars to the United States. This company is heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. As a result, they're able to produce rail cars at half the cost of U.S. manufacturers. Using this same strategy, CRRC was able to overtake and destroy the entire Australian passenger and freight rail car sector in less than a decade. According to an Oxford economic study, this happened in the United States, more than 65,000 U.S. jobs would be at stake. There are also serious national security concerns with allowing China's involvement in U.S. metro transit systems. China engages in cyber espionage, and there is no reason to think they will not take advantage of these technologies and surveillance in the rail sector. We cannot allow the U.S. government to subsidize the activities of a Chinese state-owned enterprise and help further the interests of the Communist Party of China. I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Granger. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz is recognized, and then Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In support of Mr. Price's amendment, I'd like to emphasize an issue in the amendment that I have spoken on each and every time we debate the THUD appropriations bill, and that is a provision in the bill that would make our roads less safe. As a mother of twins who attend college several hours up the interstate, who the chairman has known since they were in my belly, I'm particularly concerned that the drivers of all vehicles, but large trucks in particular, might be sleep deprived. Large truck crashes kill approximately 4,000 Americans each year and injure an additional 100,000 more, with driver fatigue often being a leading cause. A 2016 AAA study found that drowsy driving is just as dangerous as drunk driving. Of course, it's not just occupants of passenger vehicles who are at risk. Operators of these large trucks are also in danger. A national census of fatal occupational injuries study found that heavy and tractor-trailer truck drivers recorded 745 fatal injuries, the most of any occupation. And work-related roadway incident fatalities were up 9% in 2015, accounting for over 1/4 of the job-based fatal injuries that year. Almost half of those involved a semi, tractor-trailer, or tanker truck. Given the danger, no surprise that the Teamsters Union and the owner-operated Independent Drivers Association have opposed overreaching federal attempts to preempt state and local safety rules. Safety, which is something that I've spent my entire legislative career focused on legislatively, should be our top priority. Instead of allowing an industry to make an extra buck by pushing drivers to the point of fatigue at the expense of lives. The risk is too great, our lives too precious, and our constituents and our families deserve better. When we share the highways with trucks during our commutes or driving our families, we shouldn't have to worry if a driver is being pushed to his or her limits of fatigue and safe driving. And I would ask you to raise your hand or think about whether you enjoy driving past an 18-wheeler on a highway. It's a little intimidating for almost every driver. Imagine if that driver is also incredibly fatigued, making it much more likely that you could be in an accident with that person. With that, I strongly support the amendment to remove this and the rest of the harmful riders in the bill.
Thank the gentlewoman for her comments. Mr. Simpson's recognized, and then Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to, since Mr. Price mentioned sugar beets and said that this was certainly a narrow exemption here because of these sugar beets and that we were micromanaging, I hope you would understand exactly what this does. First, let me say that it's supported by the State of Oregon, the Oregon Department of Transportation, Greg Walden, who is the representative of that area. It allows an increased truck length for sugar beets on 55 miles of non-federal interstate highways in Oregon. 55 miles. The reason is that a lot of the sugar beets are grown in Idaho, and the processing plant is in Oregon. Idaho allows that length of truck, but they have to go through all sorts of machinations which cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars refiguring their trucks to go this additional 55 miles into Oregon. And as I said, for common sense, this makes sense. That's why the Oregon Department of Transportation, Mr. Walden, and others support this part of this amendment and would encourage my colleagues to vote against the Price amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just for 1 second, I'd just like to say my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I wish you would speak to the White House about your particular concerns about China. Seems to be a disconnect here. But nevertheless, I speak in strong support of the amendment offered by Mr. Price, which would strike certain dangerous provisions that would make our roads and our interstate highways much less safe. The provisions include, first, preempting state and local governments' right to set meal and rest break regulations. Second, preventing the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration from implementing a final safety rule. And third, increasing truck weights and lengths in certain geographic areas. I think we need to do more to protect drivers on the road and not less. The NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, has repeatedly cited fatigue as a contributor to truck crashes. It even included reducing fatigue-related crashes on its, quote, 2016 most wanted list, end quote, of safety changes. Allowing fatigue drivers is alarming. It is even more so considering that these riders would allow larger multi-trailer trucks on the road, despite evidence that they are more dangerous than single-trailer trucks. Each day, on average, large truck crashes kill 10 people, injure over 300. 2016, 4,317 people were killed in truck crashes, a stunning 28% jump in fatalities since 2009. These anti-safety provisions would only make these numbers worse. Moreover, heavier, bigger trucks are bad for the nation's infrastructure. If you increase the weight of a heavy truck by only 10%, increases bridge damage by 33%. The American Society of Civil Engineers, their most recent infrastructure report card, concluded that the United States must invest $4.69 trillion by 2025 to bring U.S. infrastructure up to the state of good repair. What we ought to be doing is making critical investments in repairing roads, bridges, railways, schools, airports, water systems, and more, not further eroding our highways. Finally, suspending the safety fitness determination rulemaking, which these riders would do, prevents the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration from updating the program in order to allow the agency to best identify which carriers are unsafe. So for all of those reasons, I believe we need to strike these dangerous riders. I also understand that there's an amendment being considered today to permit 33-foot double trailer trucks, commonly known as double 33s, to operate on our highways. Currently, 39 states, including my state of Connecticut, prohibit double 33s. I believe it's a mistake to preempt local laws, especially when there's clear evidence that these train-sized trucks are more dangerous to motorists and more damaging to our roads. For a fourth consecutive year, we are tacking major policy changes onto the transportation funding bill. It is inappropriate. Urge my colleagues to support this amendment, reject the efforts of special interests to rewrite the rules of the road for their economic benefit at the expense of the safety of American families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Laura. Mr. Price to close. A minute.
All right.
Ms. Lee, excuse me.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Chairman, to thank Mr. Price for this amendment. And it's very important that I thought should comply with sticking to not authorizing on appropriations bills. But we continue to do this. There are two riders in this bill that are especially important for me and my state. One is Section 151, which prohibits funding of a high-speed rail project in California. And secondly, of course, the language eliminating meal and rest breaks that more than 20 states, mind you, have established to protect truck drivers and public safety. Now, I've been a longtime supporter of high-speed rail in California, and I know that this ambitious project has encountered challenges. But the people of California support this project because they know high-speed rail will take us into the future. Adding this rider every year does not help us address the project's challenges and prevents California from moving into the future. Modernizing our transit system creates jobs, it alleviates traffic, it helps our environment by reducing transit emissions. California is ready to make this move, so I hope this committee will stop this amendment and allow us to modernize our transit system. Also, I support this amendment because it strikes the rider that undermines state laws ensuring meal and rest breaks for truckers in 21 states, including California. This is an anti-worker, anti-safety provision that we must defeat to protect common-sense labor laws that have been on the books in states like California for decades. This is really an assault on the American working class. It's also a safety issue. More Americans are killed in accidents involving large trucks than have died in all commercial airline crashes in the last 45 years. Truck drivers already work long hours in difficult conditions. Keeping the language in this bill would put both drivers and the public at risk. If we really want to set a uniform standard to protect truck drivers, as my colleagues on the other side claim, they should offer that. We should not advance a rider to undermine state laws meant to protect drivers and the public. Once again, it's curious that this is a states' rights issue that you're opposing. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Capter is recognized, and we're going to turn to Mr. Price to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of Ranking Member Price's amendment and raise my voice for transportation safety and public safety. During the last 10 years, America has not become safer because of the big trucks. In fact, the number of people who died in large truck crashes in the last decade has gone up 27%. Let me repeat that. In the last decade, the number of people who have died on our highways because of large truck crashes has gone up 27%. Those are not winning numbers for America. That's a very bad indictment. You know, I drive the roads a lot due to a gerrymandered district. And I'm old enough to remember our beautiful father, who had both a CDL and a chauffeur's license, who taught me how to drive. That was one of the roughest things I ever went through, actually, learning to drive with my dad instructing me. But he was a really safe driver. And I thank my lucky stars that he was my teacher. Back in those days, there were rules of the road where a truck wouldn't try to mow you down when you were coming down an exit. We've almost been crushed on our staff several times trying to travel to adjacent airports to our district by the lessening of standards by those who operate vehicles. Now, the drivers are being driven by their companies to do more hours with less sleep. I think it's up to 12 hours now. Who wants to be on the road for 12 hours behind a wheel? And they're clocked on their miles. And what that has resulted in is much less public safety. Many members here drive all around their districts and their states. You know what I'm talking about. Any intelligent person who's even partly aware of what's happening around you knows that you have to have acute situational awareness today because of these very, very large trucks. Now, the behavior of the entire system has become more dangerous, and the numbers show it. So I think Congressman Price is correct in offering this amendment, and I'm surprised actually at some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that seem not to notice what is changing in America and making us a more dangerous place in which to operate motor vehicles. So I strongly support this amendment and yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Price to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express my appreciation to Mr. Simpson for enlightening us on sugar beet transport, and to Mr. Diaz-Balart, Ms. Granger, for the lecture on the Chinese import of rolling stock and transit systems. That all took maybe 3 minutes, and that's the first 3 minutes of discussion and debate we've had on these topics in this committee. It kind of makes my point for me. I don't know exactly what the details are about the Chinese export of these particular products. Do we know? Are these products that propose that have a security threat attached to them? Or do they involve intellectual property theft? Do they involve inordinate state subsidies? Yeah, maybe they do. Maybe they do. But I can tell you this, the users of those imports in our country tell us that they will lose dollars and jobs if this amendment is enacted. The point is not that my colleagues who have supported this amendment are right or wrong. I don't know what a fair trade adjudication would look like in this case. I think it should be sought and received.
Yeah.
But I don't think the way to solve it is to put it on an appropriations bill. This is a complex provision.
Yeah.
If Congress is serious, if we really are serious about this issue, this is exactly the wrong way to handle it.
Mr. Price.
Let's let the authorizing committee give it thoughtful consideration, not bury it in an appropriations bill.
Thank you. Mr. Price, the question is on the Price amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Sufficient hands. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Bishop. Aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Aye. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson.
No.
Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro.
Aye.
Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen.
No.
Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris. Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Mrs. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse.
No.
Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price.
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, nay. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Rupesberger. Mr. Rupesberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor.
No.
Mr. Taylor, no. Mr. Valadeo.
No.
Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. No. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young.
No.
Mr. Young, no.
Are there any members who wish to record their vote or change their vote? Ms. Herrera Butler.
Ms. Herrera Butler recorded no.
Mr. Ryan.
Mr. Ryan recorded yes.
Dr. Harris, how would you wish to be recorded? Okay. Any further?
Dr. Harris recorded no.
Seeing no one further, the clerk will tally. Great. On this vote, the ayes are 21, the nays are 29. The amendment is not agreed to. Before I recognize Mr. Fleischman, we have 10 further amendments. So we obviously appreciate your consideration. Mr. Fleischman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of that, I will be very brief and maybe just ask for a voice vote on this issue. First, I would like to thank both chairmen and both ranking members for a job well done on this most important bill. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to speak about the issue of twin trailer length. Today's infrastructure system is constrained by a 1982 policy resulting in highly congested highways, leading to thousands of motor-related vehicle fatalities and the overconsumption of fuel. Through a zero-cost policy solution, this problem could be mitigated by increasing the twin trailer truck sizes from 28 feet to 33 feet. I wanted to respect the concerns of a few of my colleagues to find a way forward on this issue. So it's very important to note that this amendment, my amendment, is for report language only. and does not change existing law. Report language only. The purpose of this amendment is simple. It merely requests that the Department of Transportation release any and all pertinent studies and reports relating to the impact of increasing twin trailer size from 28 to 33 feet. When I vote, I want all the background information possible, and I want to understand all arguments of all parties involved. After we receive these reports, it is my hope that my colleagues and I have all the facts possible and we can move forward on this issue. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Diaz-Balart is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the sponsor for working with us. He's mentioned it rather well, and I support the amendment.
Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment. It would urge DOT to report any updated findings on the impact of increasing the length of twin trailers from 28 feet to 33 feet. Twin 33s add 10 more feet to the trucks that operate on our interstate highway system. That would result in a total truck and trailer combination length of about 84 feet. That's the length of an 8-story building. It's important to note that many trucking interests, including truckload carriers, oppose forcing the states to allow twin 33s. Of course, safety groups and labor and AAA also think it's a bad idea. Congress directed DOT to conduct a comprehensive truck size and weight study in MAP 21. DOT gave us the results of that study in 2016. They recommended that no changes be made to federal truck size and weight laws. Furthermore, DOT is still currently looking at the best way to develop a research plan to fill any remaining gaps in research. Introducing double 33-foot trailer trucks is projected to result in 2,478 bridges requiring strengthening or replacement at an estimated one-time cost of $1.1 billion, and that doesn't include the subsequent maintenance. Double trailer trucks have an 11% higher fatal crash rate than single trailer trucks. So this amendment, as I perceive it, is seeking a certain outcome, seeking a particular outcome, and that outcome would be detrimental to highway safety. It would favor certain segments of the trucking industry over others. It would also short-circuit the existing research process at DOT. For all those reasons, I urge its rejection.
Further discussion? If not, Mr. Fleischman is recognized to have a minute to close.
Thank you. In closing, I would respectfully address the ranking member's concerns. This does not increase truck length weight, but I must stress that we will be able to debate the merits of this issue on another day. This is merely report language so that we can get the data that we all need to make those decisions and perhaps dispute or debate the pertinent facts on another day. With that, I yield back and I ask for a yes vote.
Thank you for that clarification. The question is on the Fleischman amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Further amendments? Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is with tremendous affection for the chairman that I offer this amendment, with the understanding that he certainly supports the issue. But one of our most important responsibilities as members of Congress is to ensure that our seniors are able to live out their lives in dignity. Nothing is more fundamental to that dignity than having a place to live. Supportive housing for the elderly under Section 202 of the Housing Act of 1959 makes that all possible for hundreds of thousands of Americans who rely on this funding for a place to dwell that they can actually hope to afford. We have so many baby boomers that are becoming seniors, and retirement has become more precarious with every passing month, and housing costs continue to climb. Section 202 housing is becoming an even more crucial lifeline. Because of this rising need, I was pleased that the FY18, and I know we all were, the FY18 omnibus bill included sufficient funding to build new units, marking the first time that we've funded significant construction since FY10. With the number of seniors rapidly growing every year, we need to be building an adequate amount of new senior housing every year. Regrettably, this bill, as currently written, funds Section 202 housing at $46 million less than FY18, which would mean that no new construction could take place. If we fail to increase the supply of affordable housing dedicated to the elderly, it will result in increased poverty, increased burdens on family and other caregivers, and in worst-case scenarios, increased senior homelessness, which is on the rise. My amendment would fix this by increasing the funding for housing for the elderly to the FY18 enacted level. Although I would certainly prefer an increase, at the very least, we shouldn't be cutting the amount of funding we provided and allow us to have enough funding to build new units. And we would take these funds from the general fund state highway formula grants and only cut those by 1.2%, still leaving an increase of nearly $1.8 billion, nearly doubling the amount over the FY18 level. I think that's a fair trade-off and also worth changing it so that we can continue this discussion. With increased funding across the board, there's no justification for cutting funding for affordable housing for our seniors. Again, I'd prefer an increase, but at the very least, we should leave it at status quo funding. And I urge the members' support of my amendment and hope the chairman can agree to accept it.
Thank the gentlewoman. Mr. Diaz-Balart is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentlelady. Her and I have worked together on a lot of issues, and passion for the elderly not only unites us, but I think it unites everybody in this committee. So I'm pleased to accept her amendment, and not only that, to continue to work with her.
Thank you.
Not only on this issue, but other issues that, again, unite all of us. So thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I commend our colleague for offering this amendment and strongly support it.
Do you wish to close?
I do not, except to say
thank you. The question is on the Wasserman-Schultz amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the amendment is agreed to. It's adopted. Mr. Price,
Mr. President,
what care to be recognized?
Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk.
Excuse me, sorry. Mr. Price is recognized.
Amendment number 2, and I ask that its reading be dispensed with. Mr. Chairman, my
Consider
amendment,
that done.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment helps to restore the balance in this bill between transportation and housing funding. Of course, we all both support strongly housing and transportation funding, but the scales have tipped a bit, and I think there's a chance to redress that and really do justice to both components of this bill. And so my amendment would move $1.1 billion from highways. That's not even in the entire plus-up. In fact, it leaves an increase of $625 million over fiscal 18 in the highway account. But we would move $1.1 billion to various HUD accounts. And here's how we would use that money. We would increase the home program by $162 million. That brings it back to fiscal 18 levels. We would do housing for the elderly by $46 million, which, of course, is what we just achieved by Ms. Wasserman-Schultz's amendment. That portion of this would be redundant. We increase housing for the disabled by $75.6 million, there, too, going to the fiscal 18 level. The funding for home is especially strongly justified. It's one of the few programs in the bill that actually funds new construction for housing. There's a great unmet need in the country for new housing, especially for the elderly and the disabled. We've put some new construction in the 18 bill for the first time for the 811 and 202 programs, first time in a long time. We should continue to fund the new units at that level in this bill. And then finally, this amendment would also bring tenant-based rental assistance, or Section 8, and project-based rental assistance to a level that most housing advocates agree would ensure that all those currently receiving assistance would stay in their housing. Section 8 would receive $464 million above the mark, project-based assistance $380 million above the mark. Just to get a sense of who we're talking about helping here, the average annual income for those in the 202 elderly program is $13,300. The demand for the housing, this elderly housing, is so high that HUD can only provide assisted housing to 1 in 3 seniors who qualify. In the 811 disabled program, HUD estimates there are 188,000 non-elderly people currently living in nursing homes who could be transferred to Section 811 housing. These projects are in extremely high demand. They have low turnover and no vacancy rates. So we all know that the demand for quality and affordable housing is off the charts across this country, whether in rural, urban, or suburban areas. This bill has an allocation that lets us fix that. We have the allocation by virtue of the budget agreement. What I'm asking is that we do as well as we did in the current year bill, the omnibus bill. I just think we're making good on an opportunity that we shouldn't pass up, and I ask for a yes vote on this.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Diaz-Balart, the chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would oppose the good gentleman's amendment. This bill provides significant funding for HUD programs. HUD programs are funded at a total of $43.6 billion. Now, when taking into account receipts, this is $1.5 billion increase from fiscal year 2018 from the omnibus. In fact, this bill already provides a larger increase for HUD programs than it does for transportation programs. So, and let me just be clear, there is nearly a 3-to-1 split towards housing programs in this bill. By the way, so if you support housing programs, the one thing you don't want is balance in this bill. It continues our commitment to assist our most vulnerable populations, providing adequate funding to maintain the level of services we provided in the fiscal year 2018 omnibus, plus inflation. We fully funded all renewables, amendments, and contracts, and we do so without adopting any of the administration's rent reform programs. This bill provides $20 billion for tenant-based rental assistance renewals, which fully funds all renewables with inflationary increases. This level is $507 million above from fiscal year 2018. We fully fund project-based rental assistance contract renewals. The $11.5 billion represents an increase of $317 million above the fiscal year 2018. The bill provides significant funding, Mr. Chairman, for a total of $1.2 billion for home programs, which is $250 million above last year's House-passed bill and $1.2 billion above the budget request. This bill also funds all renewals and amendments for the housing for the elderly and the disabled programs. Over the past 2 years, we have provided significant funding to construct new units, $115 million to expand the number of elderly units, and $85 million to increase units for the disabled. So let me repeat. This bill provides funding to maintain the level of services provided in fiscal year 28 in the Omni, plus anticipated inflation. Those that are currently served continue to be served without any rent reforms. This is what the bill does, and I'm very proud of that. So, Mr. Chairman, I know we're running out of time, but I could go on and on and on. I would respectfully, again,
thank you, Mr. Diaz,
ask for no vote on the amendment.
For your courtesy. Ms. Lowy is recognized. We'll see if we can get this vote before we get to the floor. Ms. Lowy.
Quickly, I just felt that I needed to rise in strong support of this amendment because it would right several wrongs in this bill. This amendment would provide a much-needed increase for housing for the elderly and disabled, tenant-based, project-based, rental assistance, and the home program. This is of particular importance because the bill, while given a very healthy allocation, would reduce housing for the elderly by $46 million. We must invest in housing and resources to address the lack of supply for the most vulnerable. Please consider voting for this amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. Mr. Price, to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just reiterate the idea behind this amendment. It is simply restoring the buying power of our housing appropriations to the 2018 level. I think the numbers in the bill are quite likely to fall short of covering the existing Section 8 contracts. All the analysts predict that. And we, after making a good effort in the omnibus to finally do some new construction, long overdue new construction for elderly and disabled housing, this bill would revert to previous years' holding pattern. So it's a modest amendment. It leaves a hefty increase for highway funding in the bill, but it takes some of that increment and addresses a set of housing needs that are very, very pressing in all of our communities. I ask support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Questions on the Price amendment? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have the amendment's not agreed to. Sufficient hands. Clerk will call the roll. We're going to do this as quickly as possible because we have a series of votes It'll take about an hour, and I would ask that after those votes, if you could return quickly. We'll have 8 more amendments to go through.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris. Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price.
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano.
Aye.
Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor.
No.
Mr. Taylor, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young.
No.
Mr. Young, no.
Mr. Graves, why do you rise?
Mr. Graves recorded no.
Anyone further that has not voted? Yes,
Dr.
Yes.
Harris recorded no.
as a no. Seeing no further hands, the clerk will tally.
Yeah.
On this vote, the ayes are 22, the nays are 27. The amendment is not agreed to. We stand in recess for about an hour. Please get back on time so we have 8 more amendments. Thank you. The floor is open. Mr. Serrano, my traveling companion on the Northeast Corridor, is recognized for his amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment, and I ask that the reading be waived.
Consider it done. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment addresses the shortfalls of the Public Housing Capital Fund. As mentioned last year in full committee, it is truly time for us to take serious measures that will help to improve the living conditions and health outcomes for public housing residents. As you may know, more than 1.1 million households currently live in public housing units across our country, many which are aging and deteriorating. Public housing has been severely underfunded for decades, and as a result, our public housing stock has seen an increase in deterioration and a major backlog of capital repairs. Nationwide, 200,000 units of public housing have been lost since 2010, and 10,000 are at risk of being lost each year unless we act now to provide critical funding. Today, more than $26 billion is needed to address all public housing capital needs nationwide. In New York City, there is a capital backlog of more than $2 billion. My amendment kickstarts the process of addressing this critical funding gap. It increases the funding for the Public Housing Capital Fund to $5 billion, and it also carves out $600 million to target high-priority health hazards like mold reduction and lead paint removal. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would ask members to seriously consider this amendment and voting for it.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment unfortunately has no offset, so I must oppose. I yield back.
Yes, Mr. Price is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of Mr. Serrano's amendment. He wants to increase the Public Housing Capital Fund by $2.25 billion for a total of $5 billion, a number that many housing advocates have requested. It would also carve out $600 million to address specific health hazards such as mold, lead, and other health threats. Our nation's public housing infrastructure currently has a $26 billion maintenance backlog. In fact, capital repairs accumulate at the rate of $3.4 billion per year, so we have a way to go before we catch up. The amendment would build on the progress that we made in the omnibus to address the capital backlog hole we've been digging ourselves into for a long time. Residents of public housing are a vulnerable population who need and deserve to live in decent and safe dwellings, yet the number of public housing units has fallen by more than 250,000 since the mid-90s. Only a small share of the removed units have been replaced with new public housing. If adopted, this amendment would begin to turn that around. It would improve the quality of life for a population that desperately needs it, so I urge support of Mr. Serrano's amendment.
Okay, any further discussion? Mr. Serrano, a minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just at the risk of sounding a little melodramatic, I remember in the 1950s when we were living, my parents and I and my brother were living in a tenement in the South Bronx, and it was torn down to build a public housing project, as we used to call it then. And we were lucky. We were one of the families to move back right away into the new area and got a spanking new apartment. It was what my parents had hoped for. It's what they got. And we had a community, and a lot of what you see in me that you may like came from living there in that community and understanding that public housing was a way of life for so many people to get out of the situation they were in. So, at the risk of attempting to be funny, which I'm not, we can make public housing great again. We really can. We just have to fund it properly.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. There are a lot of things about you we like. On the Serrano amendment, the questions on his amendment, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chairs, the nays have it, and the amendment's not agreed to. Further amendments? What?
Yep.
Mr. Aguilar, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, and I'd ask that the clerk dispense with reading.
Consider it done. You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my district, just like all of ours, relies on the Department of Transportation programs to build our infrastructure and make affordable housing transportation a reality. In order for districts like ours to receive these federal resources, we need to know that the Department of Transportation is operating as efficiently as possible. That means allowing career public servants to carry out their work. That's why, since 1986, this committee has capped the number of political appointees at the Department of Transportation at 110. Despite this long-standing practice, and despite the fact that there are still vacancies in the department, or without any nominations at all, Secretary Chow has requested to lift this cap so she can make over 110 political appointments. The amendment I'm offering is simple. It follows a 32-year precedent by reinstating this cap so that the work of career DOT officials can carry on without partisan distractions. I urge my colleagues to uphold this committee's long-standing tradition of providing critical oversight by passing this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully rise in opposition to the amendment. The amendment, as the gentleman said, caps the number of political appointees of the Department of Transportation. Now, this bill platforms salaries and expenses. And by limiting the funding, we are already limiting new hiring. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. So the bill that's in front of us, it flat funds salaries and expenses for DOT. And by limiting the funding, we already limit new hiring. To add, frankly, an arbitrary appointee cap on top is similarly, frankly, unnecessary. And for the same reason, by the way, there are no caps on appointees at HUD, which is the other department that this bill deals with. So again, to me, it makes no sense to tie the DOT's hands while asking them to manage this historic investment in our nation's infrastructure. So I respectfully would urge a no vote to the gentleman's amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Price is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of Mr. Aguilar's amendment. It would simply restore language that has been in every THUD appropriations bill since fiscal year 1986. Now, the numerical cap has varied some, ranging from 138 to 100 over the years. What has remained the same is Congress's desire to restrain the growth of political appointees at the Department of Transportation. In addition, this provision ensures that political appointees at DOT stay at DOT and aren't detailed outside the department. I'm puzzled why the majority believes that this Department of Transportation can accomplish what administrations from Reagan to Obama did manage to accomplish with the cap they lived under for political appointees in place. So I urge a yes vote on the gentleman's amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Aguilar, you have a minute to close if you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I love and respect the chairman of my committee and the chairman of the full committee. I just disagree. There were also no caps at the Department of Labor, where the Secretary previously served. We have always limited the salaries in this bill. Why deviate from this 32-year past precedent? It doesn't make any sense, and I'd ask my colleagues how they would consider voting on this amendment if a prior administration had asked to remove this cap. Currently, there are 78 political appointees in the department, 17 that need confirmation. That equals 95. Why on earth would we lift this cap when she is still allowed 15 political appointments? I just don't understand why we would reduce this and pave the way for political appointees rather than public servants to make decisions at the department. I think this is reasonable oversight, and I'd ask for an aye vote.
Thank the gentleman from California for his comments. The questions on the Aguilar amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Sufficient hands. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Jenkins? Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Meng? Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse?
No.
Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price?
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roybal Allard? Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Rupesberger? Mr. Rupesberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack?
No.
Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Young, no.
Are there any members who wish to record their vote or change their vote? Mr. Bishop, you rise. Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Bishop recorded aye.
Anyone further? If not, the clerk will tally. How would you like to be recorded? No. Good to have you here.
Mr. Culberson recorded no.
Apologies. On this vote, the ayes are 22, the nays are 29. The amendment is not adopted. Further amendments, Dr. Harris?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, and I move to dispense with the reading. And thank you very much. And I want to thank the chair of the subcommittee for agreeing to work with me on this. I'm sorry for the late notice of this amendment. It's an issue came up, a timely issue, but came up just recently. Under Section 232 of the Fair Housing, of the National Housing Act, the one that insures mortgages for health care facilities, apparently in the past they had issued and insured mortgages for facilities for drug rehabilitation. And apparently in the past few years they haven't, so it's fallen out of disuse at HUD. I think obviously this is a critical need in the nation right now. This amendment would have amended report language that would just urge the department to reinvigorate this program for Section 232 insurance for rehabilitation facilities, and I want to thank the chairman for agreeing to work with me on this to see that this is done, so I move to withdraw the amendment.
Okay, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank the gentleman for bringing up this issue. I clearly look forward to working with you and important issue that he brings up, so thank you.
We appreciate you withdrawing the amendment. Dr. Price, do you want to weigh in here? He's withdrawn the amendment. Okay, thank you very much. The amendment's withdrawn. Further amendments? Ms. Lee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is Lee number 1.
An amendment
Ask for reading to be waived.
Consider it done. The gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would increase the home program by $162 million to match the fiscal 18 funding level of $1.362 billion. The offset of this amendment comes from the highway infrastructure program, which is disproportionately funded. My amendment fixes this oversight to help ensure that Congress is making all necessary investments to address the affordable housing crisis that affects all of our constituents. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, a full-time worker earning the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour cannot afford a modest two-bedroom apartment in any state, metropolitan area, or county in the United States. In my own district, if the average Oakland renter had to move tomorrow, they would be spending a staggering 70% of their income on housing. And, Mr. Chairman, this home program, it really provides funding dedicated exclusively to increasing the availability of adequate affordable housing for low-income and very low-income families. I ask for an aye vote.
I thank the gentlewoman for her comments on her amendment. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentlewoman and for bringing this up and for her passion. Obviously, I share the gentlelady's support for this program, but I reluctantly have to oppose this amendment. The current funding level for home shows an increase of $250 million above last year's House-passed bill and $1.2 billion above the budget request. And so this level is already a significant increase over previous years. And as I mentioned before, look, there's I think, unanimous agreement that we have to invest in our nation's infrastructure, transportation infrastructure as well. And so I look forward to working with her and continue to work with her. It's something that I know she's passionate about, that I am passionate about, but I would have to urge a no vote at this stage of the process. Thank you, Mr.
A lot of passion in this room.
Absolutely.
Mr. Price, would you like to add to that briefly?
Yes, indeed. I want to support the amendment and support it very strongly. Ms. Lee's amendment will strengthen the home program, which is one of the few programs in this bill that actually funds new construction and housing. The bill before us reduces funding for home by $162 million from last year's level. That does improve on the President's budget, admittedly. He suggested totally eliminating the program. But we need to do right by this program, and that would mean, I would think, not reducing the funding from the level we achieved in the current year. We all know that these housing projects get put together in complicated ways. They include funding from a lot of sources. Home is often part of the mix. It's very flexible funding. The most flexible funding we have provides critical gap funding, as they call it. It's often necessary to bring in funding from other sources, to bring in outside investment from nonprofits and local governments and the private sector. So the home funding leverages funding from a lot of other sources. It's money very well spent. It will increase the number of projects we can complete each year, and the demand for such projects is off the charts. So this lets us make a dent in this affordable housing gap that we're experiencing. So this is a well-advised amendment. It will create additional construction jobs in our communities, and most importantly, it will put safe and decent housing in reach, closer within reach, for many of our constituents. I urge a yes vote.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Lauro, Ms. Lowe, excuse me, is recognized.
I rise in strong support of my friend's amendment. The Home Investment Partnership Program provides formula grants to local communities, often in partnership with nonprofit groups to fund worthy initiatives such as building affordable housing, providing direct rental assistance to low-income people. This is a flexible program, and it's important for our communities, and in my judgment, it should be robustly funding. That's why a 12% cut doesn't make any sense. It's just unacceptable. The Lee Amendment would bring home back up to the enacted level where it should be, so I ask my friends to vote for this amendment.
Thank you. Ms. DeLauro is recognized, and then Ms. Capter, and then we're going to turn to the sponsor for a closing minute.
Thank you,
Ms.
Mr.
DeLauro.
Chairman. I want to speak on in strong support for Mrs. Lee's amendment to increase the allocation for HUD's Home Investment Partnerships Program by $162 million to $1.3 billion. As been said, the funding, it provides funding to states, cities. In my district, New Haven, Waterbury, helps to create affordable housing, low and moderate income households. It allows cities and towns to strengthen their communities expand the capacity of nonprofit housing development organizations, and leveraging private sector participation. It further enables municipalities to buy vacant land or to purchase, rehab, demolish buildings to clear the way for affordable housing. The program also provides payment assistance, loans, loan guarantees to help people purchase or rehab a home, and it helps renters with their security deposits, rent, and in some cases, utility payments. What the National Low-Income Housing Coalition says that there is a shortage of more than 7 million affordable rental homes in the United States. It's a significant increase from 4.4 million in 2000. You know, working families are stuck in jobs that don't pay them enough to live on today, and that's gotten worse since the financial crisis. You got a Harvard report. A Joint Center for Housing Studies found that a quarter of all renters in the United States spend half of their income on housing. And this could be why people are not being able to make ends meet. You've got a United Way report that says more than 40% of households cannot afford the basics of a middle-class lifestyle. That's rent, transportation, child care, or even a cell phone. Which is why this amendment is smart policy. By boosting the allocation to home, we can help keep renters in their homes, help families afford a home, and help them keep the lights on. We need to keep fighting for these kinds of efforts for affordable housing programs, which is a problem in the United States and has many, many implications. Our country should not be there for allowing us to contradict the values of this nation and providing people with the opportunity for a place in which to live. So I strongly support this amendment. Urge my colleagues.
I thank the gentlewoman for her comments. Ms. Capter is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I speak in strong support of Representative Lee's amendment to increase funding for the Home Investment Partnership Program, which was cut by $162 million compared to the current bill. This is a partial supply-side solution to a growing demand across our country. And I don't have to remind our colleagues we live in a teeter-totter society. Those at the top are doing even better. Those that are falling out of the middle class or remain stuck in the lower class are having greater and greater difficulty affording housing or getting any at all. If we go back to 2008, Congress had no problem with making Wall Street whole. The biggest banks, about half dozen of them, I mean, they caused trillions of dollars to be lost in equity across this country in all income quadrants, but especially for African Americans who lost half of their accumulated wealth since the founding of the Republic. Half. For most people who are of Latino heritage, they lost about a third, and then for the rest of us, about 20%. You know, nobody went to jail. And across this country, the housing markets were turned upside down. We still haven't recovered in places like Ohio and in other places in the country where the economy is very uneven, like in Northern California, for example. Frankly, there are homeless quadrants that are being established where people are living in tents in this 21st century. It's really amazing what is going on if you merely open your eyes. So I think that this is not going to solve the whole problem, but it pushes us in the right direction. If we could help Wall Street, why can't we help Main Street and meet some of the legitimate housing needs of the American people? And there will be a point when some of these renters will become homeowners, and that's where we need to head. And so I strongly support the amendment, and I urge my colleagues' support as well.
Thank you, Ms. Capter. Ms. Lee, you have a minute to close.
Thank you. I want to thank my colleagues for their support, and I want to clarify a couple of things. Mr. Chairman, I believe that the numbers you mentioned were not from the omnibus. Let me clarify a couple of things. Since the budget caps were enacted in 2010, home has been cut by more than half. In 2018, it was funded at $1.8 billion. In 2010, it was funded at $1.8 billion in 2010. The bill before us has a mere $1.2 billion. So this amendment would increase this year's allocation to $1.3 billion. Now, Mr. Chairman, this is extremely important because your constituents, my constituents, all of our constituents are in dire need for this kind of investment, especially at a time when there's a desperate need for more affordable housing. And also, not supporting this means, once again, we're looking at an austere strategy that's penny wise and pound foolish. Every dollar in home funds typically raises another $4 for development, according to the National Council of State Housing Agencies. So I would ask for an aye vote. We need right now to increase access to affordable housing.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. The question is on the Lee amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the
Chairman,
amendment.
may I have a roll call?
Okay, roll call.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Yes. Mr. Bishop, yes. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Ms. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse.
No.
Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Price, apologies.
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roybal-Allard. Ms. Roybal-Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack?
No.
Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to record their vote or change it? Mr. Adderholt, you're recognized. No.
Mr. Adderholt recorded no.
Anyone further? Then the clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 22, the nays are 29. The amendment's not agreed to. Just for the record, we have 3 more amendments. Mr. Price is recognized for one of those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mine is numbered 3, and I ask that its reading be dispensed with.
It's considered read, and you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would increase funding for transit infrastructure grants by $210 million and reduce funding for the highway infrastructure program by the same amount. I said earlier today that the last-minute addition of $1.5 billion in highway infrastructure program funding is, of course, good news in most respects, but it did tilt the balance in this bill. It tilted the balance toward transportation as opposed to housing, and within transportation, it tilted the balance disproportionately toward highways. So my amendment would address this highway transit disparity by restoring the usual 80-20 ratio, 80% highways, 20% transit, within the additional budget authority provided for highways and transit in this bill. Currently, the bill is weighted 85% highways and 15% transit. Specifically, my amendment would move $210 million from the Highway Infrastructure Program and increase transit infrastructure grants by the same amount. That would leave $1.3 billion in additional funding with a highway account. Now, half of this increase in transit, $105 million, would be applied to competitive bus and bus facilities grants, and the remaining half would be applied to transit state of good repair grants. Both of these accounts have capital backlogs that far exceed the funding provided in this bill. So this amendment would restore the balance between these two critical modes of transportation. I've always thought that it was a bad mistake, and advocates on both sides do this sometimes. A bad mistake to trade off highways against transit, or vice versa. We need both. We increasingly have strong public support for both. And so it does matter that in our funding bills we maintain the kind of balance that we've traditionally tried to maintain. So I urge adoption of this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Diaz-Balart is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully rise in opposition to this amendment. Look, the bipartisan budget deal has allowed us to fund the Federal Transit Administration at historically high levels. And we have made dramatic investments in transit infrastructure. And let me throw this at you, by providing record high levels for the Capital Investment Grant Program and by adding hundreds of millions of dollars to FAST Act authorized transit formula grant programs. This is important to note. The FAST Act provides $200 million more for transit formula grants over last year, which we adhere to. But we also provided an additional $800 million for transit infrastructure grants on top of that. I'm a huge supporter, as is the chairman, as a lot of us are, of transit. So the transit formula programs are funded at $1 billion, or a 10% increase above FY17 levels. Again, we adequately fund transit. We fund it at historic levels. Therefore, I don't think this amendment is necessary at this time, so I would respectfully ask for a no vote.
Right. Mr. Price, a minute to close.
Thank you. I won't take a minute to close. I'll just reiterate that what's at stake here is the balance we've historically maintained between highway and transit funding. Both are important. Both can be wisely and well spent. In the transit accounts, we happen to have serious backlogs that this would help us address. So let's maintain that 80-20 balance and apply that to the incremental funds that we were fortunate enough to receive in our allocation.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Questions on the Price amendment? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? Ms. Lee has another. It's considered read, and you care to proceed. Thank you very much.
Okay. What this funding does is increase funding for homeless assistance grants by $287 million for a total allocation of $2.8 billion, and it reduces the highway infrastructure program by the same amount. It also ensures a carve-out of $300 million within this program for emergency solutions grants. Now, for the first time, Mr. Chairman, in 7 years, homelessness increased by 9% from 2016 to 2017. That means more people were forced to sleep on sidewalks and parks and cars or other outdoor locations. Example, in my home state of California, we saw the largest absolute increase in homelessness from 2016 to 17 at 16,000 people. I see this in my district where, and I'm sure you see this in your districts, where people have created multiple homeless camps and are living with all of their worldly belongings in the streets. Many have been evicted. Evictions are also on the rise. So while wages have remained flat for the last 2 decades, rents have increased 70% since 1995. And so this is a very modest increase. It would be, you know, at least a good first start to helping address the homeless population, which is growing. Unfortunately, we didn't pass my last amendment for low-income and very low-income individuals, so I would hope that you would support the homeless and vote aye for this.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, homeless assistance grants is one of the highest, or those are one of the highest priorities in this bill. And we provided a significant increase over the grants of 218 in the Omni. And this bill provides, again, $58 million above over and above the omnibus level. So I've worked very hard with local providers, including in my area and others, to make sure that dollars that we provide protect the taxpayer while serving those in need. This bill provides full funding to renew all continuum of care contracts, and by the way, two important targeted increases: $50 million to serve homeless victims of domestic violence, and $40 million to address the recent surge in homelessness in certain parts of the country, by the way, including California. So we work hard to achieve a balance in this bill, but I can't agree to cut highway infrastructure funding when we are funding, again, the homeless program. So I would urge a no vote.
Ms. Lee, recognized to close. A minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment provides a $300 million carve-out for emergency solution grants. Unfortunately, the allocation for emergency solution grants have been flat funded for many years. We need to finally increase this allocation, and so I'm asking for an aye vote. We have, throughout the country, households, individuals that need this funding, and this should not be a partisan issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. The question is on the Lee amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
Opinion of the chair, the nays have the amendment.
May I have a roll call vote?
Roll call, sufficient hands. Clerk will
Mr.
tell.
Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee, no. Mr. Bishop.
Yes.
Mr. Bishop, yes. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee.
Aye.
Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price.
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Are there any members who wish to record their vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will tally. Mr. Newhouse, how would you like to be recorded?
Mr. Newhouse recorded no.
On this vote, the ayes are 22, the nays are 28. The amendment is not agreed to.
Well,
Ms. Lee is recognized again.
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is my last amendment. Now that,
Would you like it considered read?
yes, Lee Amendment number 3.
And you're recognized.
And also, Mr. Chairman, I will be withdrawing this. It's very disappointing that we can't support low-income individuals with increased funding to make sure they have a decent standard of living, very low-income individuals so they can have a decent standard of living, nor the homeless. I mean, those were the amendments I offered, and they were all defeated. So I'm just going to ask you and want to talk about what this amendment would have done as it relates to individuals who are the most vulnerable, who actually have a place to live, but anticipate rent hikes, and they're living on the edge. And what it would have done is implement these proposals, which are very backwards from the administration, to implement rent hikes and work requirements on some of our nation's most vulnerable. What this amendment does, it puts a stop to this proposal until the Department of Housing and Urban Development at least completes several studies which this committee has authorized and used taxpayer dollars to pay for. The department has issued some expensive contracts for studies to study whether rent reforms work. Some of these studies are longitudinal and will take up to 8 years to complete. We should at least see the results of these studies before Congress even begins to consider this proposal. So I want to make it clear that seeing the results of these studies, that does not mean that Congress will greenlight rent reform, but my amendment is important because it would put a stop to bad policy. Adding work requirements and increasing rent for all people in HUD-subsidized homes will have a detrimental impact on communities across the country. With evictions and homelessness on the rise, this proposal is incredibly ill-timed. And so what my amendment would actually do is say, let's look at the impact and what this means to those who are low-income and receiving public housing and Section 8 assistance. But once again, I just have to say I'm going to withdraw this amendment, but just know we're on record today voting against increasing the standard or helping with the standard of living for the homeless, for low-income people, and for very low-income people. We're talking about lifting people out of poverty, and this committee, in my estimation, given its funding levels and not allowing an increase in funding for these populations, are really making life a lot harder for people living on the edge.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Okay, yield back. The question is on the
I'm withdrawing that.
Oh, it's withdrawn. Okay, excuse me. This concludes the amendments. Are there any further amendments? Seeing none, the gentleman from Alabama is recognized for a motion.
Chairman, I move to favorably report the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill for FY 2019 to the House.
Thank you. The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion and the bill moves to the floor. We want a recorded vote. A recorded vote is requested. Sufficient hands. Clerk will tally.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amade. Mr. Amade, yea. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. No. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter.
Aye. Mr. Bishop, you all right? Okay. Okay.
Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, nay. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, nay. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Ms. DeLauro. Mr. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, yes. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, yes. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, yes. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, yes. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, no. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price.
No.
Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Aye. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Aye. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. No. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Fiskalowski. Mr. Fiskalowski, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye.
Are there any members who wish to record their vote or change their vote? Mr. Culbertson. We'd be happy to.
Mr. Culbertson recorded aye.
Anyone further? Mr. Molinar's right?
Mr. Molinar recorded aye.
Anyone else? If not, the clerk will tally. Mr. Bishop, how are you recorded?
Mr. Bishop recorded yes.
She wanted me to get up at the end after you spoke to make a speech. No, about the bill in general.
On this vote, the ayes are 34, the nays are 17. The bill is adopted and moves to the floor. Unless there's any further business, I ask unanimously accept the staff be given authority to make technical and conforming changes to the items approved today in 3 days, reminded by the ranking member. Don't go anywhere. We're moving right ahead here. Our second and final order of business this afternoon is consideration of the report of the suballocation budget allocations for fiscal year 2019, our 302Bs, long awaited. These 302Bs, the top line number for each of our 12 subcommittees, abide by the bipartisan budget agreement of 2018 to continue funding for both defense and domestic priorities outlined by this bicameral deal. First and foremost, these suballocations prioritize robust national security, rebuilding our armed forces, securing our homeland, and supporting our law enforcement agencies. These 302Bs represent a balanced, responsible approach to government spending, ensuring domestic programs are also adequately funded. This includes funding for infrastructure, efforts to combat opioid abuse, school safety, address school safety issues, among other important investments. These allocations were done in consultation with the subcommittees and reflect the prioritization of programs in the best interest of the nation. We do not, nor should we, have unlimited funds to spend. While there may be many important programs across the federal government, tough decisions have to be made as to what best provides the most benefit to the American people. Any further discussion? Ms. Lowy is recognized.
Mr. Chairman. This thing is... Mr. Chairman, for the last month, Democrats on this committee have been demanding to see the full slate of subcommittee allocations. We need these figures to understand how each appropriations bill fits into the larger picture and whether our work as a whole will meet the needs of the American people. Now we understand why the majority wanted to keep secret for as long as possible the priorities it has chosen in the fiscal year 2019 spending bills. They shortchange middle-class families and vulnerable people, which is why Democrats stand united in opposition. The Bipartisan Budget Act, reached in March, provided for an $18 billion increase for both defense and non-defense discretionary spending between fiscal years 2018 and 2019. The increase in non-defense discretionary spending, which was the product of months of negotiations between both parties, was intended to fund investments that create jobs, grow the economy, help hardworking families get ahead. Yet the majority devotes a quarter of that increase, nearly $5 billion, to the Department of Homeland Security, presumably on President Donald Trump's border wall and deportation force. Not only is such spending a betrayal of our American values, it's frankly a waste of resources that crowds out needed investments across the other appropriation bills. For instance, despite increases for both the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Energy and Water bills, the majority cut the COPS hiring program, which puts more police in our communities to keep us safe, and ARPA-E, which invests in the clean energy technology that will power our future and grow our economy. Those cuts come in bills with increased allocations. The majority does not provide a single penny in additional resources to the largest non-defense domestic spending bill, Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education Appropriations bill, which funds so many programs that improve the lives and well-being of American families. Providing no increase for the Labor H bill could starve our schools, hurt job training, workplace rights protection, jeopardize Pell Grants, and limit access to affordable health care, among many other ill effects. So unless something dramatic changes and we're proven wrong, here's where things stand with these spending levels. The majority would rather build President Trump's wall and then rather than fund these other worthwhile initiatives. So we tell you where it is. Let's move on.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. A further discussion, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, Ms. DeLauro, and then Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly object to the majority's 302B allocations. For example, I have no objection, obviously, to the allocation for the Milcon VA bill that our former subcommittee chairman, Mr. Dent, and I worked on together, and that the full committee approved a few weeks ago. That bill has historically received a reasonable allocation, albeit sometimes at the expense of other bills. This year's Milcon VA bill once again gives the Department of Veterans Affairs the resources it needs to support our veterans and active and reserve service members. But, Mr. Chairman, I was disappointed that for the second year in a row we were forced to mark up a Milcon VA bill without knowing the allocations for the 11 remaining bills. I'd like to ask my colleagues to think about how most people make their household budget decisions. Would you buy a car or incur a major expense without knowing how much you needed to spend on other important items? Of course you wouldn't. Well, this process is worse than that. This process has been like if your spouse insisted you go on expensive vacations and renovate your kitchen without knowing how much money you needed to repair the roof. Your marriage wouldn't last very long if you made decisions like that, and neither did the spirit of this budget agreement. This year, especially, the process should have been better. The bipartisan budget agreement enacted in February provided relief from unworkable discretionary spending caps by giving this committee a bipartisan top-line number for FY18 and FY19. This agreement was supposed to provide the nation with stability following a year of shutdowns, last-minute veto threats, and general uncertainty in government. Unfortunately, that stability only lasted long enough for Congress to pass a bipartisan omnibus appropriations bill for FY18. Since the passage of the omnibus, the majority is now seeking to pass a rescissions bill to undo this funding and mollify an angry president. We've been told by OMB Director Mick Mulvaney that this is the first of many rescission packages meant to bring spending in line with the President's priorities, which ignores congressional action that dismissed the President's FY17 and 18 draconian budget requests. And now, despite calls to return to regular order, this is the first time we are seeing the entire set of 302Bs after marking up 5 bills in full committee. This is extremely disappointing and irresponsible, and it is nowhere close to regular order. The majority once again, unfortunately, abandoned long-standing committee practice to provide the members and the public with a budget blueprint for discretionary spending. Asking members to vote on bills without knowing the full budgetary picture is unfair to every member who serves on this committee. In addition to these serious problems with the process, there are also serious problems with the policy that these 302B allocations seek to advance. Now that we have the full picture, I'm concerned, for example, that the majority's Homeland Security increase is designed to satisfy the President's fetish for an ineffective border wall, while neglecting many DHS core programs that actually make us safer. In addition to these vital security programs, the funding that the President and the majority want to waste on a wall would be better spent in the Labor H bill, where it could be used to truly strengthen our nation and improve people's quality of life. So I thought it was important to make those comments, Mr. Chairman, on the 302B allocations. It would be great if we could really return to regular order, vote on the 302Bs, and actually see them at the start of the process, because inexplicably we continue to do it this way, and it's really irresponsible.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your comments. Mr. Lauro is recognized, then Mr. Bishop, and then Ms. McCullough.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise or speak in strong opposition, as you can imagine, to the proposed 302B allocations. The allocations for non-defense discretionary spending are unacceptable. Despite an increase of $18 billion for non-defense spending, the Labor HHS bill is being held to level funding. The Labor HHS subcommittee represents nearly 1/3 of non-defense discretionary spending, yet it has been systematically shortchanged over the last few years. Fiscal year 2016, after the bipartisan budget agreement, the other non-defense subcommittees received an average increase of 6.9%, while the Labor HHS bill increased by only 3.4%. 2017, the Labor HHS bill's allocation was cut by more than $1 billion. Fiscal 2018, the Labor HHS bill received about $4 billion less than its proportional share of non-defense funding. Once again, the majority is shortchanging the Labor H bill, and out of the $18 billion for non-defense spending, the Labor HHS bill should be receiving an increase of about $5.5 billion. Instead, the majority is allocating none of the increase to Labor HHS. Who is making these decisions? And for the record, let me note that the Senate has increased its Labor HHS allocation by $2 billion. What's the result? Level funding for Labor HHS threatens a continuation of historic increases for NIH research. Everyone on this committee talks about wanting to increase NIH research by an additional $2 billion in 2019. But if the Labor HHS bill is level funding, that would require cutting existing programs by $2 billion. In addition, Labor HHS bill is losing $500 million in opioid state grants, which were funded for the past 2 years by the Cures Act. But those funds were limited to 2017 and 2018. They are not available in 2019. So if you level fund Labor HHS, your states will see a large cut in funding to their efforts to combat the opioid crisis. Everyone here then is giving, or those who will vote for level funding for HHS is giving lip service to wanting to do something about an opioid crisis. To make matters worse, the Trump administration is proposing to shift $3.6 billion in funding for community health centers from the mandatory side of the budget to the discretionary side. The administration's proposals would do nothing for community health centers, but it would mean an additional $3.6 billion in cuts to critical programs in the Labor HHS bill. That is not all. This allocation forces CDC to scale back its efforts to protect Americans by preventing infectious disease outbreaks abroad, even as a new Ebola outbreak continues in Central Africa. The Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, has even introduced a bill to rescind $252 million that Congress provided to respond to Ebola. I cannot imagine anything so short-sighted. No sense, no brains. Apparently, there are more rescissions coming. The allocation means no investments in early childhood education, including Head Start, Early Head Start, Child Care and Development Block Grant. Even the historic increases for some of these programs, historic in fiscal 2018, we're still woefully behind. Right now, 5 out of 6 eligible children are unable to access child care assistance. 7 out of 10 have no access to Head Start. And at the current funding level, only 8% of eligible children under the age of 3 have access to early Head Start. This allocation means no new funding to help job seekers across get access to the skills that they need to compete in a 21st century economy. You know, the subcommittee had a bipartisan hearing on this not long ago. State grants for career and technical education, apprenticeship programs, they help Americans in good-paying jobs. The experts from across the country made it very clear we need to increase funding. There was bipartisan agreement. There was bipartisan agreement about the value of this effort because, simply put, we cannot compete if we cut. Was this hearing a waste of time? This allocation also means no new investments to help students afford a post-secondary education. We know the majority of jobs require at least some education or training beyond high school. Yet, financial aid is not keeping pace with rising college costs, forcing students to bear more of the burden. The programs in the labor HHS bill are more important than ever. And finally, this allocation will mean no increase for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, state grants. Congress committed to pay 40% of the cost of educating students under IDEA, but we provide less than 15%. Title I formula grants, which help provide equity and opportunity for students, support. Mr. Chairman, I will be through in a short order. Short order. Student support and academic enrichment grants, which help schools provide a well-rounded education for safe and healthy students, will see no increase. The list does go on. Meanwhile, we are dealing with bandits who are proposing a rescission package. It would cut balances in the children's health insurance program by $7 billion and simply send them back to the Treasury. We should be reinvesting in critical services for children and families. We are moving backwards. This is the people's bill. We should seize this opportunity to invest in long, short-change programs that provide critical services in our communities. We should be increasing funding, as we are with other appropriations bills. I urge my colleagues, oppose these allocations. They're irresponsible, they are reckless, and they are damaging to both defense and non-defense spending. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bishop's recognized, and then Ms. McCullum, and then Mrs. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to commend you for finally presenting to the full committee the FY19 suballocations for consideration and approval today. Although the committee has now completed consideration of the military construction, Veterans Affairs, legislative branch, and agriculture bills, and the THUD bill now, we now have the opportunity, finally, to see the full picture of what lies ahead for the remaining bills which are yet to be considered by the full committee. We've done a pretty good job so far at providing for our veterans, our rural communities, our farmers, our military bases, our energy and water infrastructure needs, and ourselves here in the legislative branch. And it would appear that we'll also continue to fully fund and support our defense and military-related requirements and other important areas of the federal government. However, the picture and outlook for our most unfortunate in society, both here at home and around the world, is not good. The cumulative impact of starving these programs year after year after year after year after year is untenable. Shifting more burdens on our working-class families and the most vulnerable among us is not acceptable. As we move through this process, I would hope that we'll be able to ultimately ameliorate this inequity and improve the current picture and the outlook for the programs that are aimed at providing a basic safety net for the least of these in our society. A helping hand, a hand up, not a handout. I support and associate myself with the comments of the ranking member, Ms. Loy, and with my colleagues who have spoken in opposition to this 30B allocation. We need to do better, Mr. Chairman. We owe the American people better.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Ms. McCullum is recognized.
I thank the chairman for the time. Last year when we approved the 312B allocations, we approved them one at a time as we marked up the bill. So when we got to the end of the process after doing the math, we knew what was left for HHS. This year, we have a different but still secretive process. Today, we are considering the complete list after marking up half of the bills. My question is, when is the majority going to get back to regular order? When is the majority going to be transparent with the American people and consider the full slate of allocations at the start of the process? In February, we passed a bipartisan budget agreement for non-defense discretionary spending for 2 years. But even though the non-defense top-line spending level was set in law as $18 billion higher than fiscal year 2018, the bill that I oversee, the Interior, Environment, and other related agencies, was flat funded. These investments that we make in each one of these bills, they are interconnected, and they're interconnected under the budget caps. I find it deeply troubling that when we mark up the first 6 of these bills, not every member of this committee could say with certainty that a vote to increase funding on one bill would not come at the expense of critical programs in another. Increasing military construction, that it would not come at the expense of education. Increasing Homeland Security funding would not come at the expense of health care. American taxpayer deserves to know if we are robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's wrong, and this is not how this great committee should operate. So because of this process has been the opposite of transparent, I must oppose these allocations. I thank you for the time, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. McCollum. Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I too rise in opposition to these allocations. It's ironic that we're doing this to ourselves, isn't it? We have a 2-year budget agreement that let us write relatively generous bills in the omnibus just a few weeks ago, and yet with this budget agreement and with a clear path forward to do this in a bipartisan way and to bring bills to the committee and to the floor that have broad support, we seem to be blowing it. We seem to be forfeiting that chance for a bipartisan process and a collaborative process as we do our work. I think it's a shame. I imagine we will sooner or later come back around to a bipartisan approach, since that is the only way we can do our work and have it on budget and on time, maybe not on time. We could do that, but increasingly we seem to think there's no way to do this on time, that we have to go through a lot of drama, a lot of near shutdowns and showdowns until we finally get where we need to be. We could do it better this time, and we're not doing it, and that's a shame. And these allocations are indicative of a flawed process. And the other members have said what some of the trade-offs might be. I don't know. I haven't seen the Homeland Security bill yet. I wouldn't be too surprised if that generous allocation, the increment, goes to some kind of foolish border wall project or increased enforcement. We're seeing in my district random arrests and deportations in great numbers now. Maybe we'll do more of that. In the meantime, the Labor H bill, as we've heard from numerous members, is flat funded in a way that really spells a reduction in critical accounts. The opioid epidemic is perhaps the most obvious area where we need to make investments. We all know of strong areas of need: health research, early childhood programs, so much that we could do and that is within our reach. This is not something that awaits the action of our leaders or some other actors to get us where we need to be. We're there with this budget agreement, and yet we have a set of very divisive and hyper-partisan allocations here before us tonight. We can do better than this, and I guess we start by rejecting this proposed set of allocations.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Serrano,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the 302B allocation proposed by the majority. I am troubled that we are only now discussing the full allocation list as we debate the sixth bill for 2019. This discussion should have taken place weeks ago, not now. I'm not sure what prevented these numbers from being revealed in a more timely manner, but one is left to wonder if the games being played with the potential precisions bill have something to do with it. Unfortunately, these current allocations reveal some serious flaws in the priorities of the majority party. Instead of investing in our workers, students, and researchers, these allocations hold the labor HHS bill flat. As a result, our colleagues on that subcommittee will face some difficult problems as they seek to balance numerous important competing priorities. The Homeland Security bill received an unjustified and significant increase of more than $4 billion. I'm not sure what this money is supposed to be allocated to: an unnecessary and ineffective wall on the southern border, further detentions and inhumane family separations, more agents at CBP and ICE who will abuse their powers and create fear in immigrant communities. I reject the idea that we should cater to the whims of the anti-immigrant elements of the White House and the Republican Party here. We should use this opportunity to stop efforts to implement the discriminatory statements put out on a seemingly daily basis by this president. We can have an immigration system that acts rationally and humanely and protects our citizens, and we don't need the amount of money included in this allocation to do that. That money could be put to much better use. We could be providing more money for Pell Grants to help more students afford college. We could be increasing NIH research grants to find cures for dangerous and harmful diseases. We could be working to train or retrain our workers to be successful in the new economy. But these allocations prevent us from doing just that.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. I recognize Ms. Capter, then Mr. Ryan, and then Ms. Lee.
Like my Democratic colleagues, I rise to oppose the allocations proposed by the Republican majority. And we really have to ask ourselves whether America is going to be a nation for some or for everyone. When our own bill, that I have something to say about, Energy and Water, came before us, it had a good allocation, but expressed my concern at that time, what would it mean for bills that followed ours? The suite of 302B allocations before us will leave us woefully short on a number of Democratic priorities of others, and others have recognized, particularly in the Labor, Health, and Human Services bill. Now, as I look around my region in the country, the number of individuals succumbing to serious drug addiction is not going down. And without a robust allocation, funding of state-targeted response to the opioid crisis grants could face a cut of $500 million for opioid prevention and treatment below the FY18 level. If we are truly dedicated to fighting the opioid epidemic, we must continue to fund evidence-based treatment, support, and recovery for people in our communities. Moving forward, the number of baby boomers retiring across our country is going to require more on the health front. We already see that. We cannot afford to make cuts to our health workforce programs. Certainly, we are experiencing already a terrible shortage of physicians. And with some of the immigration restrictions being imposed, I can guarantee you that shortage is going to get worse. With a rapidly aging population, we have an obligation to fund federal programs like the graduate medical education and student loan programs for repayment to replenish our supply of doctors, nurses, and other health professionals. And I haven't noticed that the cost of education is going down for any of them. So I have to express a deep concern about what is going to happen on the Labor, Health, and Human Services side as some of the rest of our subcommittees are plussed up, perhaps too much. our friends in the Senate have managed to move through the allocation part of this process in a bipartisan fashion, and I wish that the majority in this body had taken that same approach. Since they have not, I urge my colleagues to reject their misallocation of taxpayer dollars, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Capter. Mr. Ryan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to add my voice and opinion to what's happening here today. We had a deal. That's the frustrating part of what we're talking about. We had a deal that many of us took a lot of flack for, and we did it because we believed that this was a mature, thoughtful first step into reclaiming our responsibilities here as the Congress, as the House of Representatives. And I actually thought, maybe naively, that it was a recognition that simply cutting taxes for the wealthiest people in the country was not a solution to a good, strong economy for everyone. And what we're seeing here is an attempt where we will see deep cuts to programs that give average people a ticket into the middle class. Whether it's job training programs, we have many jobs that are opened across the country today, mid to high skilled jobs that go unfilled. We have millions of people who are in lower skilled jobs. It's our responsibility as members of Congress and public policy leaders to figure out a way to close that gap so our economy can be strong and people can get into the middle class. You see these statistics coming, you can read them every day in the paper. 43% of the American people can't even afford a $400 emergency in their lives. How many people don't have any savings? These programs, whether it's an opiate program, a labor program, a workforce program, an education program, there's a reason we have these, because they help people get into the middle class. And so this is a terrible event, because I thought, like many other people did, we were moving in the right direction. We were getting this train back on track, and clearly we're not. I think it's an attempt to divide again, divide us here in Congress, divide us with our budgets, and try to pick between certain priorities that we have. I mean, how do we back away from the responsibility we have with the Center for Disease Control, with what's going on in the world? How do we turn our backs on people in Ohio, West Virginia, New Hampshire, these other states that are being ravaged by the opiate epidemic? We're turning our backs on them. That's what this is. I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but that's actually what happens. These policies matter. I'm deeply disappointed. I support this effort to reject this and try to keep the train on the track here, and it doesn't sound like it's going to happen. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And then Ms. Lee.
Let me provide for my friends on the other side a little bit of context here. The Labor H budget is $16 billion higher in this allocation than it was in FY17. That's about 10%. We just happen to get most of it up front. For those of you that are worried about the NIH, it had the second largest increase in its history last year, and I can assure you it will get another increase this year. For those of you that are worried about the CDC, last year we increased it more than President Obama ever proposed to increase it. It'll get an increase again this year. So every single one of us in every single committee can always think of something more to do, because there legitimately always is something more to do. But being an appropriator, in my view, is about making priorities. I don't think defending the country is the wrong priority. This allocation does it. I don't think looking after veterans is the wrong priority. This allocation does it. I don't think making our borders secure is the wrong priority. This thing does. I don't think investing more than President Obama invested in the NIH and the CDC is the wrong priority either. So we can have these debates endlessly, but there aren't any cuts in this budget. It's level funded after a 10% increase last year, a $16 billion increase. So believe me, while we could always use more money, and I don't want you, Mr. Chairman, to think that I wouldn't like more money. I always would like more money. You show me a cardinal that wouldn't, I'll show you somebody shouldn't be a cardinal. But I will tell you that you have adequately funded our needs. You have put us in a great position given what happened last year. You've kept us there, and guess what? We'll be in negotiation with the Senate at some point along the way as well, and I suspect things will change. So I think it's a little early to hit the alarm bells, and I think we ought to be grateful for what the chairman provided to us last year, which was the largest increase that we have had in well over a decade. So with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ms. Lee, you're recognized. We're going to...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say that I also believe that really it's a shame that this committee has forced us to vote on 6 bills already, and we're just now getting to the 302 allocations for the remaining subcommittees. This has become all too familiar with the majority, keeping our committee members and the American public in the dark about our top-line numbers. You've really normalized an abnormal process. Last year, we passed the Budget Control Act, which provided top-line discretionary and non-discretionary funds for the next 2 years. Yet here we are with all top-line numbers that prioritize defense spending above non-defense discretionary accounts that help invest in people. This is a misguided approach. It's at the expense of the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Subcommittee, for which I sit on, and it will get flat funded this year. It's really a disgrace. I'd like to yield the balance of my time to our ranking member, who has something to say in addition to what she laid out as it relates to the consequences of this dangerous approach.
I thank the gentlewoman from California, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would ask,
keep it relative.
I will, Mr. Chairman. We've waited a long time for this discussion about 302B allocations, and with all due respect to the chairman of the subcommittee, who I have a great deal of respect for, and we have worked cooperatively in the past, and I look forward to working cooperatively in the future. However, if the chair said we are going to increase NIH by $2 billion, if we are going to increase the Center for Disease Control, if we are going to increase money for the opioid crisis, what in fact are we going to cut, Mr. Chairman? Are we not going to talk about that as well, or is this going to be a never-ending saga of what we think, just to placate folks here, and otherwise that we are for increasing these funds, and everything else, can be pushed aside. You can't do more with less. You wind up doing less with less, Mr. Chairman. I have said that to you on many, many occasions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Laura. Is there any further discussion? Are there any amendments? I recognize the gentleman from Alabama for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee approve the report on the 302B allocation for FY 2019.
The question is on the motion of the gentleman from Alabama. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay.
No.
In the opinion,
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted, and a recorded vote, sufficient hands.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee, yes. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright.
Nay.
Mr. Cartwright, nay. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson.
Please give the clerk your attention.
Mr. Culberson. Ms. DeLauro.
Hell no.
Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, yes. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, yes. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, yes. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, yes. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCollum.
No, thank you.
Ms. McCollum, no. Ms. Meng. Ms. Meng, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinaro, yes. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price.
No.
Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rooney. Yes. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard, no. Mr. Rupesberger. Mr. Rupesberger. Mr. Rupesberger, no.
Please give the clerk your attention.
Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, yes. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, yes. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, yes. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, Mr. Young.
Yes.
Mr. Young, yes.
Are there any members who wish to record their votes or change their vote? Yes, Mr. Culbertson.
Mr. Culbertson recorded aye.
Then the clerk will tally, seeing
Graves.
Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, record me as an aye.
Aye.
Mr. Graves recorded aye.
Seeing no further hands, clerk will tally. Okay, on this vote, the ayes are 29, the nays are 22. The motion is agreed to. Unanimous consent. The 302Bs are reported to the floor. Unless there is any further business, I ask unanimous consent staff be given authority to make technical conforming changes to the items approved today. Ms. Lowy, 3 days.
Absolutely.
Say it again.
3 days.
3 days, and
We just can't let
anything further.
It's not fair to the,
If not, I want to thank the Chairman Diaz-Balart and Mr. Price for putting a great bill forward. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank the staff for doing a great job. We stand adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.
What is on the schedule tomorrow morning?
I'm calling to see if I can meet with Nancy and get it done.
I think
Either we have a strategy or we don't.
you.